Good day, everyone. Welcome to the One Open Door podcast. This is a place for talks and conversations about Zen awareness practice and about how to live that practice right here, right now, in this very world we inhabit. I hope you enjoy the program. If you're someone who would like to have support for your practice, or if you would like to participate within the practice that I facilitate, you'd be most welcome. I would encourage you to go to www.theoneopendoor.org and see what we've got going. We're doing a variety of things. We have meditation, virtual meditation over Zoom every morning. We have 2 groups a week on Thursday and Sunday, 7 Eastern over Zoom. Also workshops, practice days, retreats, classes, and so on. And so if you feel like you would like to participate, and I would love it if you would, just let me know. There's a contact form you can fill out and send me a message through the website, or you can just email me directly at djmckay429@gmail.com. I'd love to get to know you, and I'd love to have you participate in our Sangha. Okay, and so now on to the program. So today I would like to talk about the old not enough time conditioned process, which as far as I can tell is pretty much universal in our culture. Maybe not absolutely universal, but pretty darn close. And I want to get into stuff like time and what is time and what's the nature of time and, practical things like to-do lists and overwhelm and what overwhelm is all about and stuff like that. But before I do, I want to try a little something. This is a bit of an experiment. And so if you have feedback, I'd be really open to hearing it. I'd like for us to take just very briefly, just for a minute or two, a little bit of time together to get present and get into our bodies and out of conditioned mind and just present and aware. Okay? And so if you are someone who has it set up that you're just listening to the podcast, you're in a really good place. If you're listening to this podcast while you're attempting to accomplish other things, which I completely understand, if you have the willingness, I'd encourage you just to stop for a moment. This will only take a minute or two. And just stop and just listen to the sound of my voice and follow the these little directions I'm going to give you. And just give yourself a little bit of space to let go of accomplishing things and just get here. Okay? So first off, just turn your attention to your breath and your breathing. And feel your breath as it enters your body and fills your body and leaves your body. For a few moments, just see if you can focus all of your attention simply on your breathing. If you notice that you have thoughts crowding in upon your awareness and trying to distract your attention, which you probably do, that's fine. But see if you can just let them go for now and focus your attention on your breath. And fully allow yourself, just for this little while, to be fully here and fully present right here, right now. If you notice your attention becoming distracted, getting caught up in something, just let that go. And without any kind of judgment or any kind of assessment, just let it go and bring your attention back to your breath. And focus your attention on your breath. And be aware of what it is to be present. Notice what it is to simply be here as best you can. How does presence feel in your heart? What goes on in your mind when you're just simply here in a place of awareness? for a few more moments, just practice that. Practice being here. Notice if your attention wanders away into the past and future in some form. Worrying, anticipating, rehashing, that kind of thing. Planning, making lists. And whenever you notice that, just let it go and bring your attention back to your breath and your breathing and to the experience of simply being present and aware. Okay, thank you very much for that. And now let's move on to the not enough time process. Okay, so first a bit of background. So within conditioned mind, there's various ways of talking about what conditioned mind is. One way of talking about it is that it's the set of beliefs and assumptions about the way things are that are false, untrue, made up, that cause us to be a separate self in a state of survival in this world. Another way of saying it is it's the collection of unconscious processes that go on that have the same result, to be a separate self in a state of survival. It's a survival system, basically, that we are all taught to give our allegiance to when we're little bitty kids, and then we end up practicing and following for the rest of our lives, unless we're lucky and discover awareness practice and find the way out. We end up living the rest of our lives in survival without even realizing it, and doing kind of these formulaic responses to life and our circumstances. Formulaic meaning out of our past, things that we learned to do a really long time ago that are no longer choices, instead of having conscious, aware, present choices that we're making that actually do fit our circumstances and that are skillful and intelligent and clear. So within conditioned mind, there are these processes that go on. And when I say process, what I mean is it's like one thing leads to another for a particular result. So in the one we're going to look at today, the not enough time process, is a process like that. It has the particular result, as we'll be talking about, there's a lot of ways of talking about it, but of sort of constricting life into a place where there's not an expanded awareness, and introducing urgency and things like that that are stressful and unhappy. And that process, if we're engaged with it, will cause us to live in that state. Another example, there's many, but here's another example of process. You might call it a process of dissatisfaction. So in a process of dissatisfaction, it doesn't matter what happens, it's not good enough. There's always something wrong with everything. So even if I've gotten exactly what I want, I'm going to find something about it that's not quite right, so that I can always stay dissatisfied. And the point of both those processes, the not enough time process and the process of dissatisfaction process, is that, as I said earlier, I end up being a self that is outside of life, fighting with life, feeling, unhappy and deprived and that kind of thing. That's what conditioned mind is always going for, because, as I've said many times and in many places, that's how we learned how to survive. We learn how to survive by being a self that is unhappy, essentially. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is look into this not enough time process and see, how it works, what are some of the different elements of it, and talk a little bit about the alternative. Where's the place that we can live instead of in this not enough time process, in relationship to whatever we're doing in our lives and our responsibilities and all the stuff we have to do and everything, in this busy, modern world that we live in. And I want to start off in a place. I'm going to get terribly philosophical and abstract with you for just a moment. I hope you'll indulge me. Some people enjoy that kind of thing, some people don't. If you're somebody who doesn't enjoy it, then tolerate it, I will ask, and then we'll get to stuff down the road here in a little bit that's much more kind of practical and applicable. But what I want to talk about first is about time, and what time is, and the different kinds of relationships we can have with time in general, before we go on to the relationship with time that happens in the conditioning process that we'll be exploring. So what is time then? Well, I think the simplest, most direct answer from me is I don't know. I don't have any idea. There's lots of people who have, thought about these kind of things and have explanations for them, but none of them really satisfy, I don't think. Because I don't feel like there's a way to know something like that from an objective place. There's only a way to know it kind of from a subjective, experiential place. So I don't know what time is, objectively speaking, like, from the perspective of divinity, you could say. But I do have some thoughts about what it is in terms of my own experience. And I want to just talk about that a little bit in order to give some context to the process we'll be exploring in just a few moments. So the way I've always, this is not always, this goes back for, I don't know, a couple decades anyway, that I have thought for myself about time and what time is that time is the way we experience change in relationship to objects in space. So let me say that again. Time is the way we experience change in relationship to objects in space. So that sounds very complex and abstract, but it really isn't actually. Let me try to explain that a little bit. So if you have objects in space, everything is changing all the time. That's something that the Buddha taught. Everything is in constant flux, which is certainly my experience in the world of form. Nothing is staying the same. Everything is in movement. And time to me is sort of it's a requirement because of the way our minds are put together as a human being. We have to have some kind of a mode through which we experience that change, and time, I think, is a word that we have for that mode. So if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If there's no objects and no space, there's no time, because how could there be? Everything is just the same. There is no change. And so how could there be no time if there is no change? When we move into a place where we're experiencing time, we're in the world of form. We're in the world where things are changing, and we have an experience of that. And typically from a human point of view, it's a linear experience going from, what we call, when we look back at it, or we look at it, we kind of zoom out, it looks like it's going from the past to the future. In reality, though, when you really look at it, that's not what's happening, right? Because, as is very common to say these days, there is only the moment. There is only this moment. And so it's not so much that it's going from the past to the future. It's just that in this moment, change is happening. And yet, as human beings, we experience the change happening typically in a linear sort of way. It's moving from one thing to another. So we don't, in other words, experience everything, all the change that's ever happened, happening at once. It goes this, and then this, and then this. The sun rises, the sun goes through the sky, and then the sun sets. And because, this is my speculation, it's because we have bodies. Our bodies fixate us in the world of form. Because we're in the world of form, we experience time. Because we are in the sort of the reality in which there is form, the trees and the birds and the sunshine and the vehicles and the pencil and whatever else may be, our bodies. So we're in the world in which those things exist, and in that world there's constant change, and so we experience that change through this sort of mode of experience that we call time. Okay, so that's the super abstract and philosophical part. So this next part is slightly less abstract and philosophical. See what you think of this. That it seems to me that we make this really big assumption, and to me this is a part of our cultural conditioning, actually, what I'm about to say. We make this conditioned assumption that time is uniform and regular. I don't know what it was like to live as a human being before there was such a thing as a clock. And of course there are not that many people, I don't suppose, but there are people who still live on this earth without clocks. I don't know exactly what time looks like to someone like that, but for those of us, in our culture, clocks in the sense of the hours, and there's 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, and then that's divided into the minutes and divided into the seconds. That's been a part of our culture for a really long time now. And so there's an assumption that comes out of that time is a regular thing. And it's moving uniformly. And that's the way we're supposed to experience it, I think. But I'll tell you, that is not my experience. And I bet if you look, you'll see that's not your experience too. So for example, a couple examples of that. I worked, after I got out of the monastery, I worked at this place. It was as a wilderness therapy field guide. And loved, it was a really fun job. And my job was to work with troubled teens and adolescents. They had all kinds of things going on, drug addiction, a lot of them, not a lot, some of them were suicidal, just, dysfunctional, different stuff like that. And we would take them out into the wilderness in Colorado and Utah and do these kind of therapeutic processes with them. And one of the things we talked about there was the difference between, I can't remember what word was used there, but I tend to think about it as linear time. That might have actually been the same way it was talked about there. The difference between linear time and what they called sacred time. And sacred time, I discovered, is a thing. And I knew it already, but I really hadn't had such a kind of a concrete way of talking about it before. So what happened is we'd be out in the desert someplace, or up in the Colorado mountains, depending on the time of year. And there would be these things that would happen where maybe one of the students would erupt, which was frequently happening because they were, highly triggered and didn't know how to regulate themselves emotionally and stuff, and they were there to learn those kind of things. So a student would erupt and something would happen, and then we would come together, and then there would be this process that we would do to sort of help that student realize what was going on and, move to another place. And sometimes that was not successful, of course, but sometimes it was. And when it was, occasionally what happened that as a group, we would move into this place where the time changed. And it would feel like we'd go through and do this process, and then afterwards, like during the process, we wouldn't be paying attention to our watches. The students didn't even have watches. They had no idea what time it was. The staff did, because it's useful to have a linear sense of time, because then it can tell you what times the sun's going to set and what time do we need to stop and set up camp and that kind of stuff. But during those kind of processes, typically even the staff would just ignore their watches and would just be in this experience. And we'd go through this experience, and sometimes it was very intimate and complex, and the other students would get involved, and beautiful things would happen. And then after the process would be over, then, and we would get up to go to the next thing, we'd look at our watches and go, wow, that's unbelievable. I would have said that was hours long. And sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was only just a few minutes, like 15 or 20 minutes. So like that. And it would really feel like we had moved into a different state, a place where time stretched out. Another place that I had that experience was at the monastery sometimes, where, and I do now too, but I just remember it particularly from the monastery, where during meditation, sometimes it was fascinating because we always sat for the same amount of linear time. We always sat for half an hour, and we would do that several times a day. And but it was always for a half hour, not a minute more, not a minute less. You would ring the bell to begin meditation at exactly the top of the hour or the bottom of the hour, whenever it was, and ring the bell to end meditation exactly a half hour later. But my experience of the length of time that progressed during those linear 30 minutes was profoundly different depending on what was going on with me. So one thing that might be going on with me, and this was often what was going on with me, was I'm freaked out, triggered, in conditioning, resisting, upset, something like that, because, the environment of the monastery was designed to produce experiences like that, actually, so that we could see into the nature of those kinds of experiences and learn to let them go. And so if something like that was going on, generally it would seem like that half hour was forever. Like, this is never going to end. I mean, I swear I've been here for hours, right? So that was one experience of it. But then it was interesting because, I also sometimes, and of course the longer I stayed there, the more I had this experience, I would be actually present during meditation some of the time, or a lot of the time. And when the presence would happen, and that would happen more, the longer I stayed there and more I practiced, of course, the more that happened. At the beginning, that hardly ever happened at all. But towards the end, I got to where that happened quite a bit. And so it was interesting because I had two different experiences of that. One experience was kind of similar to the one I just described when the conditioning was happening, but different in that the space that half hour occupied seemed just like vast. Similar, so that's similar to what I was describing in the wilderness therapy program. It just felt kind of vast. Like, I know this is only a half an hour, but I feel like I've been here forever. I feel like I've been here for a really long time. But I also had the opposite experience. Sometimes it would be, I would sit down and the bell would ring, and then it would seem like a moment later, the bell would ring and I would get up. Now, it's interesting because there's all these parallels. I also had something that felt like that experience that was a conditioning experience where I would sit down, conditioned mind would start talking, or fantasizing or something. I would leave the moment, go off into the fantasy, and be gone for the entire 30 minutes, and then the bell would ring and I would suddenly come back. And in that case, often it would also seem like, it went by just like in a flash, like that. There wasn't any time at all because I wasn't there. But it was interesting because there's also this other experience where it seemed like it went by instantaneously because I was there. Very interesting. So I just offer those things because from my point of view, I don't think linear time, I think linear time is a thing, but it's not the only thing. There's different ways to experience time. And I wanted to kind of just throw that in to provide a context for when we get into talking about time and how conditioned mind tries to manipulate time, then just to provide a context for that. Okay, so now let's ask ourselves next, what causes time or our experience of time, let's say, to expand, and what causes it to contract? The contract is easier to talk about, I feel like. See what you think of this, that what causes our experience of time to contract is distraction. Okay? And that's really easy to see. I mean, I think everyone has that experience. You distract yourself in some way. I mean, what I just was talking about in meditation where the conditioned mind comes in and starts fantasizing about something, that's basically a distraction. We can also use outward things to distract. I'm sure you've had the experience where you sit down, you watch a movie, and you just kind of disappear. And then, when the movie's over, you kind of wake up like, oh, here I am. During that time, the time, in terms of our experience of it, contracts, at least in my experience, because I wasn't particularly there for it. So it seems like it just kind of instantly goes away. Or if I'm distracted, like let's say, what would be another good example? So this is similar. It's just I'm not watching a movie. I'm watching kind of a movie in my head. I'm in a fantasy, let's say. This is going to happen. Oh, it's going to be so wonderful, and they're going to do this, and she's going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to feel this. If we get involved in that kind of thing, we could spend actually a large amount of time, linear time in that, and not be there at all, and just suddenly wake up and realize we're gone. Do you know that experience? It's really particularly obvious in meditation, but just, everywhere in life. When we allow our attention to wander like that, while it's happening, there's kind of an element of time, it kind of seems like, but once it's over, it's the time has just disappeared because we essentially weren't there for it. And so, even so much though, to relate it back to objects in space, let's say I'm in a fantasy, in my fantasy, I'm relating to imagined objects in space, but I'm not at all attuned to the actual objects in space that are around me in my body. And so there's no experience of time in relationship to the sun going across the sky or whatever. There's only this relationship to the imaginary things. And so there's kind of this sense of time in the fantasy, but my actual experience of time in physical reality has not happened because I haven't been here. Okay, and so what causes experience time to expand? Well, in my experience, what causes time to expand is presence, consciousness, awareness, which are all kind of words from the way I look at it, kind of words for the same thing or kind of words for different aspects of the same thing. So when we're here, in general, time slows down and we fully experience it. So, do you know the difference between, maybe you've been on retreat, or maybe you've given yourself a kind of a retreat day? The difference between that and a day full of work and business. A day full of work and business, a lot of times will just go by, just like just extremely quickly. And you suddenly go like, oh my God, I can't believe it's nighttime already, because I've just been, my attention has been, engaged in all this content all day. As opposed to, like you say, you're on retreat where there's nothing particularly to do, or, what would be another scenario? You're like, you're driving down the road, you're all busy in your mind and everything, and your car breaks down. And suddenly you've got to deal with this completely different situation. You get present with the situation, and you have to, figure out what to do and everything, and be creative. Time is going to slow way down. Generally, I think that's my experience anyway, if that happens. So if you contrast those two kinds of experience, one of them, there's not much presence because the attention is engaged in all the content. And of course, you don't have to lose presence because you're busy and engaged with things. It's possible, and we'll be talking about this more in a bit, it's possible to be fully present and have that sense of expanded time while you're doing things and engaged with things. But that's a skill that has to be developed over time. In general, I think someone who hasn't done a lot of spiritual practice doesn't have that experience particularly, because they immediately get lost in whatever there is that they're doing. And when I say they get lost in it, what I mean is their attention gets lost in it. They lose the awareness of their attention, and then the time just goes by without realizing that they exist, basically, that they're alive. So the contrast between that, the experience of just the attention is lost in the content of things, and the experience of the attention is residing in awareness and consciousness, and I'm aware of where my attention is, and my attention goes to the thing over there. I notice, I'm sitting outside right now, for example, and there's these really tall grasses, and I notice the grasses over there just kind of swaying in the breeze. And then I can move my attention, and over there's some laundry that I've got hung on the laundry line. And if I'm aware of my attention moving from one place to the other, it's very spacious. And I'm in time kind of expands in that, because I remain in the moment. I remain in the place where time is actually kind of unfolding, you might say. If I allow my attention to go someplace that's not here, I lose that, and I'm not aware of the moment unfolding. I'm just in these kind of like flat. So the kind of difference between two-dimensional and three-dimensional. I'm in these two-dimensional places where I'm not aware of time unfolding, and it's just I'm just kind of lost in these some kind of fantasies that are happening without awareness attached to them. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that distraction contracts time, and presence expands time. And so let's look at this from the point of view of conditioned mind then. So assuming that's so, and you have to look to your own experience to see if that's so for you, but let's just, for the sake of this conversation, let's just assume that's so. What then does conditioned mind do about that? And again, conditioned mind is its work, its job, you could say, is to keep us from being present and conscious and aware, and to keep us living perpetually, basically, in a fantasy. Could be a positive fantasy, or more often, an unhappy, suffering, struggling fantasy. So what is its relationship to that? Well, it is working to distract us and to contract the experience of time that comes with presence. That's why distraction is such a big thing in conditioned mind. Conditioned mind is throwing stuff in all the time, saying, "Hey, look over there," or "What about this? What about that?" Or also, "You blew it. What are you thinking?" These kind of self-hating sorts of things. So it throws those things in, and then it causes us to identify with a self that is, believing the reality of what it's presenting. And then we move into this flat kind of two-dimensional place that's outside of life unfolding. Practice, one way of talking about practice is undoing that process. Being aware of the tendency to distraction, and being aware of the actual distractors, what it is that conditioned mind is throwing in to kind of pull us out of the moment. And through that process, to move into a place of presence and awareness. Or to say it another way, this is a simple way of saying it, drop the story and then time expands. And by the word story, I mean, it's a fiction being created in conditioned mind about, what's wrong with me or what's wrong with them or wow, this isn't the way it's supposed to be or, whatever, all the kind of things that conditioned mind is talking about all the time. Drop the story and time expands. We get here. Okay, so that explains, I think, what this not enough time scam is all about. Conditioned mind is trying to get us to be in a place of believing that. There's not enough time. Okay, why? Because if I'm in a story, basically. And so if I'm in a story, then I'm a separate self and I'm safely in my survival system. So the not enough time scam, in other words, is a story. It's a story that's happening in conditioned mind. And ironically, if we believe that story, we have the experience that the story is attempting to provide, which is always what's happening in conditioned mind. And in this case, if you believe the story that says there's not enough time, your experience is that there's not enough time. But not because that's a reality, but because being in a story contracts time. It makes it seem like there's not enough time for anything. So let me say that again, just in case that wasn't clear. So conditioned mind creates a story that there is not enough time. And the effect of that is it produces the illusion that there is not enough time. And the reason that's useful to conditioned mind is because that it causes the story to seem real. And if the story seems real, then that's useful to conditioned mind because then a person will believe it. And they will live in the story instead of living in presence and consciousness. And then they'll be safely in conditioned mind, this survival system that, is supposedly helping us to survive in this world. And of course it isn't. It did at one time, actually. When we were little kids and didn't have the capacity for presence. Well, not presence. We were present as kids. We didn't have the capacity for consciousness. We needed some kind of formulaic way to survive in this crazy conditioned world. So it did help us in the beginning, but we don't need that anymore as adults because we have the capacity for consciousness. We just don't know how to be conscious, and we end up living in these formulaic places instead. And this not enough time process that we're talking about is a way in which conditioned mind is kind of continually maneuvering us and manipulating us so that we will stay in this sort of childlike relationship to life where we're not conscious or present, and we're acting out these formulaic responses to everything that don't actually work. That's kind of the purpose of it. Okay, so now let's look at, so how does this not enough time process get created and maintained? Or to say it in other words, what's believable? What does condition do that we believe that causes us to go with this process even though it doesn't make any sense? It's not real, and we don't have to live in there's not enough time place. So what does it do to kind of make it seem real to us? Well, one of the things it does is it sets up artificial and fictional expectations for the way things need to be. Or you might say it sets up artificial standards for the way things need to be. So for example, what would be a good one? I need to get all this done. If I get all this done, then I'm going to feel like I'm a good person, right? I bet just about everybody can relate to that, because part of, one of the conditioned things that is very prevalent, and especially in Western culture, and especially in American culture, I think, for those of you who might be listening who are American, is, your self-worth is determined by what you accomplish. Isn't that interesting? When you look at this in terms of this process, like embedded in our cultural conditioning are these broad assumptions that support all these little processes that our conditioned mind is doing all the time. It really is a remarkable system. I mean, you kind of have to admire it in a certain way, just by, how clever and how airtight it is. So, but anyway, so there's this assumption that, my self-worth is determined by what I accomplish. And if I believe the reality of that, then I'm going to go out and try to accomplish things. And with the idea that if I can accomplish certain things, then I have value and I can feel good about myself. The trouble with that, of course, is that our self-worth and our value has nothing whatsoever to do with what we accomplish. Those are, a state of being is not at all connected or relevant to a state of doing. Those two things those are completely different worlds. And so that doesn't hold. There's no reality to that. But if I believe it, then it is as if that's really true. And so I will, I will attempt to accomplish a bunch of things so I can feel good about myself. And the other problem with it is that there's no way that's going to happen. Not because it's not possible to accomplish things, because of course it is possible to accomplish things, and even remarkable things. But because this is a conditioned process, conditioned mind is going to make sure it is positioned as the evaluator of what's happening. And so it's going to make sure that no matter what you've accomplished, it's not enough. Do you know that one? You might be doing something now that, a few years ago, you never would have been able to imagine you'd be able to do. But if you're involved with conditioned mind, it's going to say, that's not enough. You haven't accomplished enough. You still don't get to feel good about yourself. Or, something else like, you're just getting lucky, something like that, to discount it. And so if we believe, for example, that I have to accomplish in order to feel good about myself, then I'm going to need lots of stuff to accomplish. And so I'm going to fill my day up, I'm going to fill up my linear time with things to accomplish. And the more I do, the better off I'm going to be. So I'm going to sort of automatically end up in a place where there's not enough time. Because I've just filled up all the space with stuff I have to do. And essentially, basically what I'm doing is there's not enough time for presence. Because my attention is going to be lost in all these things I have to do, and there's going to be an urgency that goes with that, and I'm going to be in conversation with myself about it. Oh my God, I got to do this, and I got to do that, and I got to do that, and then, well, what about that? But I'm not going to be able to do that, and these kind of things, and hurry, and then that erases all of the experience of the potential spaciousness that is in life when we're present and we're conscious. Or here's another one that happens a lot. Somebody, and there's a lot of people like this, I think I'd have to say, anybody who's really involved in conditioning is like this, in certain ways. I don't want to be present with myself because that's scary. I don't know what I'm going to find there. I have a belief maybe that if I get present with myself, I'm going to find out that I'm not a good person, or I'm not likable, or I'm not lovable, something like that. That's very common conditioning. And so I need to make sure that there's no space for me to get present with myself. So I'm just going to throw tons of stuff in. And if there isn't anything that I have to do, I'm going to make up something to do. Or I'll distract myself. Okay, oops, there's a little bit of space. All right, get on the internet and look up, God knows what, in order to get away from myself. So there's another place where, it looks like actually having real time, real sacred, spacious time is scary. So I need to avoid that by filling it up with stuff and making sure that I stay in this distracted place where the time is kind of non-existent and not allow myself to go into a place where the time expands. Well, here's another one that's kind of the same and kind of different. This is classic too. You've got your to-do list, right? Well, how do you decide what needs to be accomplished on the to-do list? Well, you could look at that from a centered place. We'll be talking more about this in a minute, about kind of the alternatives. You could look at that from a centered place and say, well, realistically, I feel like this is probably what I might be able to accomplish today. Okay, now let me cut that in half. Because, we all know that it never turns out the way, or almost never turns out the way we expect it to. Because, just all kinds of complications happen and, other things show up that are asking for our attention or whatever, So we can, just make it really reasonable what our expectations are. That's one approach. The other approach is to set completely unreasonable expectations about what we're going to accomplish, and then attach some kind of sense of value or self-worth, like I was talking about before, to it, and then basically set out in the day to accomplish what we feel like we need to accomplish, and failing at that. I bet you know that process, don't you? I bet everybody listening to this has done that, in their life, and probably does it a lot, actually, where let's just fill it up. Fill it up. Make sure it's more than we can possibly do so that we can end up feeling bad about ourselves, And again, within conditioned mind, that's what it's all driving to. Ultimately, I want to be in a place where I have failed to be the person that I believe I should be, and I'm beating myself up for that, that's the end of the line for conditioned mind in every circumstance. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that there's processes within processes. So there's this overarching process of not enough time, and then everybody has their own kind of sub-processes that they do, like the ones I just outlined, that are sort of support and maintain that larger process. So how am I going to do not enough time? Well, I've got some good ways of doing that. I've been doing this for a really long time. I'm really good at them. Okay, and so here's another one. This is just something I just know for myself, too, and other people, just talking to other people, that people really struggle with. It's what we call overwhelm. So to me, overwhelm is another one of those kind of sub-processes that are inside the not enough time one. That's just one way of looking at it. I mean, you could put them kind of under different categories. But, overwhelm, you know what overwhelm is, right? It's the place, it's another way that we end up in these contracted states of survival where we're not present and we're not conscious. So what is overwhelm? Well, to me, when I look at what overwhelm is looking at everything that needs to happen at once and kind of assuming there is no linear time. Do you know that one? So like what is the way to peacefully, in a centered, enjoyable way, accomplish some project, even some kind of complex project with a lot of steps? Well, you have the big picture of what needs to happen, and then you have a sense of what needs to happen now, and then a little bit later, and a little bit later, and then you have a sense of what needs to happen right now in order to, what's the next step towards accomplishing this goal or this project? Well, one option is to go through and just do things one step at a time. You got to have the big picture too, because your efforts need to be directed towards the accomplishment of this goal, if that goal is going to be accomplished. So it's not this. I'm not talking about the same thing as just, I'm just following my nose around, basically. So you have to have a sense of the big picture. But having this sense of the big picture, letting go of thought, worry, concern, letting go of those standards and expectations we were talking about, letting go of any attachment of self-worth or any of those kind of things, or we also were just talking about, to what I'm accomplishing, and just doing one thing at a time. And that can absolutely be done. It's incredibly difficult for a conditioned human being. It takes a ton of practice actually to be able to do that, but it can happen where we just go one step at a time. We do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and it's spacious. And in the space is peace and joy and well-being and a connection with ourselves. That's why this whole thing is important, that I feel like that we're talking about today. In that kind of sacred space, the space of sacred time, that's where we get to have our lives. That's where we get to experience ourselves and have the experience we're having. We don't get to have the experience we're having when we're in urgency and in overwhelm and in these different kinds of places. So that's one way of doing it. The other way, this is the more common, this is the conditioned way, is I'm going to look at everything that has to happen with that project as if it all has to be done right now, and it's totally overwhelming because it can't be done right now. It only can be done in linear time. You have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do that. It can't all be done at once. But in this really weird way, we will kind of, people, and I'll do this too, we'll look at the thing, and it's like, oh my God, that's too huge. I can't possibly do all that. Well, if you're looking at it as if it has to be done all at once, that's true. You can't do it all at once. It's totally overwhelming. But if you break it down into all the individual steps, it's not overwhelming at all. Okay, so that's the overwhelm part. So that's just another kind of aspect I see of the not enough time process that people do. Okay, so let's move on now and start talking about what are the alternatives to being in the not enough time process. I just talked about that a little bit in terms of doing one thing at a time, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to throw in, this is sort of an aside and sort of not. This is something I found to be incredibly helpful in getting out of the not enough time scam thing that goes on. It's really helpful to be organized and to have a trustworthy place to collect the information that you need. If you don't, some people have that and some people don't. People who tend to be outwardly successful and like tend to actually have that, but not everybody. Some people are able to just kind of wing it and get away with it. But by and large, I would say, at least from what I can see, people who are outwardly successful in the world tend to have a good way of organizing information. And the reason that's important is because if you don't have a way of organizing information, typically what happens is the other way to do it is to constantly be repeating it to yourself. It's like, okay, I've got an appointment tomorrow at 2:30. Wait, I have an appointment tomorrow at 2:30. I have an appointment tomorrow at 2:30. You have to keep kind of reminding yourself to make sure that you're going to be there at 2:30. Because if you don't, very likely you're going to go unconscious at about 2:15. That one, and then totally forget the meeting, because conditioned mind is going to go, 2:15 is go, hey, look over there, and cause you to forget to be in the meeting. It's just classic conditioned sabotage. So the alternative to having to have that junk in your mind, to have to repeat that in your mind, is to have a way to collect it. So in this case, you have a calendar, and you put that very reliably. If you've got a meeting at 2:30, it goes on the calendar, and you're going to look at the calendar so you don't miss anything. So it's kind of like sort of having an external brain, and so I'm going to put this information in my external brain. So it could be in the calendar, a good way of, organizing to-do lists, all that kind of stuff. There's lots of, information out there about how to set up good information systems and technological things that are available and everything. But to have a good system like that, what it allows you to do is take the stuff that's in your head that's repeating and put it someplace that you can trust, so it'll be there when you need it, and it'll show up when you need to have it. And what that allows you to do is not have to have that in your mind. And it creates a space in your mind, which is lovely. It's so lovely to have space in your mind, for the reasons I was saying a little while ago. That's where our life is. That's where joy and love and connection and belonging and pleasure, and beauty and harmony, the experience of harmony, like in nature, is. You've got to be present to have all those things. And that's the juice. That's what makes life worth living. If you're having to constantly remind yourself of everything you have to remember, then there's just not going to be any space for it. Okay? So a little word to the wise. If you're someone who has systems, great. That's fabulous. Use them, right? And resist the tendency to repeat stuff to remind yourself of things anyway, because you don't need that if you have a good system. If you're not somebody who has a good system, it's a really good idea to create one, to create more space in your mind. Okay, and so what is the alternative? Well, the alternative, I think, is probably pretty obvious from what I've said. It's to be here. It's to be present. It's to do one thing at a time. There's an art form, I think, in life that is that. To just go through and do one thing at a time. Now, I'm not saying, now that I've said that, let me qualify it. I'm not saying to do one thing at a time without awareness of the big picture, like I was saying a minute ago. I'm talking about doing one thing at a time with awareness. So, for example, sometimes when I talk about stuff like this, somebody says, well, that doesn't make any sense because, what about planning? What you're talking about is a world in which you can't plan anything. It's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about at all. Planning is an in-the-moment activity. If it's done correctly, if it's done from consciousness and presence, it's an in-the-moment activity. So, for example, let's say I got to go visit Uncle Bill in Minnesota. I'm over here in North Carolina. Well, I can't just, I have to plan that. If I don't plan that, then there's no way I'm going to make it to Uncle Bill. Let's say I'm going to fly there, for example. Well, I have to buy a plane ticket. I have to buy a plane ticket at a certain time. I got to know, how am I going to get to the airport? When can Uncle Bill pick me up at the airport? All this stuff. So the in-the-moment way to go about that is, okay, it's time for me to plan that trip to go see Uncle Bill. So I'm going to sit down. I'm in the moment, and it's just like any other task. So I have to look up, see what time are the flights? How much do they cost? I have to make an evaluation in terms of what can I afford. I have to communicate with Uncle Bill about what time will work for him. When he can pick me up, or, do these 3 days work better than those 3 days? All of that is in the moment stuff. That's what I'm doing right now in the moment. I can do all of that one thing at a time. And then, then I finish planning it. I've worked out, okay, I'm going to take this flight. It gets in at such and such a time. There's plenty of time for Uncle Bill to get there. We still can get to the thing we got to go to together, or whatever. And then I've accomplished that. I've planned it, and then I'm done. And now it just sits there. The work has been done. And then when it comes to the day to go visit Uncle Bill, then I'm still doing it one at a time. Okay, the flight's at 10. I need to leave at, 8:15 or whatever it is in order to get to the airport in time. And so now I'm doing that. And then I'm at the airport. And then I'm going through security. And then I'm doing this. And then I'm doing that. One thing at a time all the way through. Super spacious. So when I'm talking about doing one thing at a time with awareness, what I'm saying is that there's a context. We are aware. Right now in this moment, we can be aware of the context that, what else is happening today? What else is required? What else I might be responsible for? And we can be aware of that as we are going through and doing one thing at a time. And so our efforts and what we're attempting to do and accomplish or whatever is being guided by this greater awareness that we have. So I'm not talking about a blindness. I'm not talking about us becoming like non-human animals who are obviously very present, and it looks really pleasant, in a lot of ways to be a non-human animal, as long as that non-human animal is in good circumstances, that are healthy and good. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about being in a place, this is what I project, where planning is not capable, we're not capable of that. Where we're just kind of following our nose through life and just responding to things. We have this, I think, this larger capacity as humans to actually have a big picture, work towards goals, accomplish really big things over time that require a variety of steps, but without losing ourselves in that, because we're present. And when I say because we're present, what I mean is because we're not engaged in the conversation with conditioned mind. I'm not allowing I'm not indulging the thinking, that's a better word. I'm not indulging the thinking about how, oh my God, well, but, if I don't get this done, what's going to happen, and that's going to be horrible, or, am I doing it good enough? All these kind of things that pull us out of the moment and into a place where our experience contracts and we stop actually experience life as it's simply unfolding moment by moment. So as often the case with kind of the positive side of practice, the part that is, not involved with looking into conditioned mind and letting go of conditioned mind, really easy to say, really hard to do. Talk about simple, right? Just be here. Just be here and do things one thing at a time. Just go step by step in life, being present and aware of what you're doing. Super, super simple. Really easy to say, and at least in my experience, takes a lifetime of work to be able to accomplish, even somewhat consistently. And yet, to me, that's the work. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing in spiritual practice. I would even say that's what we're here in this life to learn to do. That's what we're here. If we're going to accomplish anything in life, that's it. That's the thing to accomplish, is to learn how to be fully here. Because, as I was saying earlier, our lives are here. If we're not here with the experience we're having, if we're not present with our experience moment by moment, then we're not living. We're not having a life. We're just in some kind of two-dimensional fantasy. And life in a two-dimensional fantasy is not worth living, especially since it's all, sooner or later it's going to turn into some kind of unpleasant, suffering, unhappy fantasy, because that's just always what happens in conditioned mind. So let's be here. Let's be here in this life. Let's just go moment by moment, step by step through life as best we can, and that's not going to be easy, but let's practice it. Let's practice being here and allow ourselves to just spaciously move in sacred time, moment by moment, with life unfolding. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your time and attention. Take care of yourselves. Be well. I'll talk to you again soon.